All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to my presentation, Omission of Emissions, Volkswagen's Failure to Maintain Public Relations Excellence. My name is Spewak. I'm a junior communications major with a focus in public relations. All right, so this is a pretty big crisis that's going on right now, and even if you do not own a Volkswagen, you are still affected by this. So who is affected in any sort of organizational crisis? Of course, the organization itself is affected. They are greatly impacted, as I'm sure you can imagine. However, it's the stakeholders who are probably the most important impact and effect group in any sort of crisis. Because without stakeholders in an organization, there is no organization at all. So a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today is Volkswagen admitted to knowingly installing defeat devices into their clean diesel vehicles from 2008 until 2017. This is a case study that analyzes Volkswagen's public relations in relation to excellence theory and crisis communication. So, for my case study, I of course did a literature review, and what I'm going to do first is define three main terms that you're going to hear me talk a lot about today. First is pre-crisis, which this is basically just the calm before the storm. Pre-crisis stage involves three steps. Signal detection, which is when you environmentally scan any sort of issues or potential risks to your company. Second is prevention, which is any sort of step or maneuver that you could take to avoid any sort of crisis or issue. And then third is when all else fails, it's crisis preparation. Then of course there's the crisis itself, which a more technical definition than you may think is the perception of an unpredictable event that threatens important expectancies of stakeholders and can seriously impact an organization's performance and generate negative outcomes. Then of course, post-crisis is when seemingly everything is settled and an organization must decide what to do next. I'm only going to talk about two articles today. The first one, and probably the most important, is written by the father of excellence theory himself, James Grunig. It is titled Excellence Theory in Public Relations, and basically what it states is that we're just kind of reminded, as an organization, public relations is only effective if it actually solves problems. It doesn't just brush them under, doesn't put them aside, doesn't give you any other thought other than the problem itself and the solution that is being made. And then, of course, it meets expectations and goals of stakeholders and management. This is very key, and we'll see this in Volkswagen. Instead of just trying to get the bottom line and to make revenue, it also has to make sure, as an organization, that we're meeting the expectations and goals of stakeholders and our public. Organizations that maintain public relations excellence keep both the public and organization's best interests at mind. There are four main conclusions from this. We will cover two. And the first one is, and probably the most important characteristic, is that organizations incorporate strategic management involvement, which is defined as the process of managing the pursuit of the organizational mission while also managing the relationship between the organization and its environment. So while an organization is striving towards meeting its goals and upholding its core values, it's also maintaining a very positive relationship with the public and the environment that it exists in. This basically, in order to do so, you might ask how. Public relations is given access to management and decision makers. But on top of that, public relations is given a voice and a power within those people. In order to be effective and to have strategic management involvement, public relations must be incorporated at every step. The second conclusion is that public relations will lose power and their strategy will not work if tasks are just simply diverted to marketing and other management. So a lot of times, especially in Volkswagen, which we're going to talk about, is that when a crisis occurs within an organization, oftentimes that organization, their only strategy is just to divert directly to marketing. There's all these marketing promotions, advertising schemes, and all these things kind of happen. You're seeing it all over social media, on TV, billboards, where they're trying to promote themselves and their new core values rather than actually solving the problem itself. The next article is again written by the father of excellence theory, which is Grunig, and his colleague Dozer, and it's a manager's guide to excellence in public relations and communication management. And what this says is that PR excellence is both listening and speaking. So I'm sure all of us have heard in every single one of our communication classes that you have to both speak but also listen, not just hear what your public and your stakeholders are saying. You have to be able to understand what their complaints are, what their expectations are, and their goals. And this article also suggests that organizations must maintain the integrity of the game. They should keep their values and morals, but also be visible and completely truthful. Oftentimes, the public does associate silence with guilt. And this article does suggest to avoid all of those. So, of course, my method, as I mentioned, was a case study about excellence theory and crisis communication. I did a literature review of 5 scholarly articles, along with another analysis of Consumer Reports and Car and Driver, which had great knowledge of Volkswagen, the emissions issue itself, and the organization. With this, I did a deep analysis of Volkswagen as a whole, the emissions crisis itself, and their response strategy. So a little bit about Volkswagen. Does everyone know what Volkswagen is? Yes? Anyone drive one? All right. So even if you don't, like I said, you are still impacted by this crisis. Volkswagen is the second largest automotive maker in the entire world. They own 7 other entities: Audi, Bentley, Bugatti, Lamborghini, Porsche, and then the UK brands Seat and Skoda. In 2014, Volkswagen alone controlled 12.9% of the passenger car market, and that's not even to mention their hand in commercial making. They're in 153 countries and have just under 600,000 employees worldwide. They're massive. They have 2 core values, and that's responsibility and sustainability. To define responsibility, we're going to call it moral, legal, or mental accountability. And in Volkswagen's case, they feel morally and legally accountable for their vehicles and their consumers. Sustainability, we're going to define as involving methods that does not completely use up or destroy natural resources. Volkswagen promises each and every customer that their vehicles have a long and safe lifespan, and that they also promise clean and eco-friendly products known as their clean diesel vehicles, which is exactly why they're in this crisis today. So, a little bit about the emissions crisis itself. I define this crisis as 2 different types: organizational misconduct, also known as misdeed, and then also technical crisis, which Anthony touched on earlier. As for organizational misdeed, the management makes decisions knowing the harmful consequences that could be placed on both the organization and their stakeholders. This is pretty evident because what Volkswagen did was, for 7 years, they knowingly installed defect software into each and every clean diesel vehicle. And what that did was it made their vehicles appear cleaner than they actually were, when in reality each vehicle produced 40 times the legal limit of nitrogen oxide. And this was actually a huge violation in the United States upon the U.S. Clean Air Act. And as I mentioned, this occurred for about 7 years until September last year. So just to give you an idea of how widespread this is, 11 million vehicles are impacted. However, the air we breathe right now is impacted. We are breathing those extra emissions right now. They face about $18 billion in fines in the United States alone under that Clean Air Act. Additionally, the U.S. Department of Justice has just launched multiple criminal investigations, as well as other civil lawsuits that are being made right now. But probably the biggest thing that they're going to feel as an organization is the loss of public and consumer trust and respect. Within 24 hours of this crisis hitting, their stocks dropped drastically, and they've felt a huge financial wave since then. So to give you an idea about their response, the EPA, I think early September in 2015, accused Volkswagen of these allegations of your vehicles are not actually producing the right amount of emissions, something is wrong, someone tipped off the EPA, and that this is how that started. That's also kind of denial. They didn't really acknowledge that there was any sort of problem whatsoever. And then all of a sudden, 15 days later, the Volkswagen executives held a press conference in which they apologized for their actions and said, yes, we knowingly installed defeat devices into each clean diesel vehicle from 2008 to 2015. However, immediately after their apology and accepting their wrongdoing, instead of owning up and moving forward, they excused their actions that they had to tamper with this software because they couldn't actually come up with the technology to make true clean diesel vehicles. And after they excused their actions, they used scapegoating and so that the engineers were given the final say-so, that they were allowed to say yes or no when installing defeat software into each and every clean diesel vehicle. So, as I said, the response was a number of things: denial, scapegoating, excuse, and apology. However, what they really did was exactly what they shouldn't have done. Volkswagen boosted marketing, and they continue to say we're responsible, we're sustainable. They tried to give a message that they are friend and family oriented. Additionally, they weren't always transparent. A lot of their press releases were kind of vague. They didn't exactly come out very clean. Oftentimes they were silent and they hid from press. And here's a few examples of their over-advertising since September 2015. Of course, this is safety and family-oriented, all about buckling up and enjoying the ride. Next is e-reindeer powered, sustainability and eco-friendly. And then this is about speed and excitement, but also sustainability and clean diesel. So my results from this case study are pretty obvious in my title. Volkswagen is not an organization of public relations excellence, especially according to Grunig's excellence theory and any sort of crisis communication. And here's why. They failed to accept blame fully. Instead, they diverted tasks to marketing, which Grunig specifically said absolutely do not do. Take it head on, solve your problems, and be involved with management. PR had absolutely no access to management. Instead, like I said, everything was shifted to marketing and advertising. Instead, PR wasn't really involved. There were poor press conferences, little answers, and absolutely no transparency. So in conclusion, as I said, Volkswagen is just not an organization that upholds PR excellence. Although as of yesterday, they are starting to get onto the right path. According to Consumer Reports, they named 4 separate titles in order to kind of move forward and attempt to gain trust back. The first is technical, and that's to ensure that drivers are getting the right car. They're getting what they're paying for, they're getting what they think they are purchasing. The next is financial, and this is what happened yesterday. They must compensate victims and pay any sort of fine levied to them, whether that's through the United States Clean Air Act or anything that's going on in the UK with any sort of violation. And yesterday they decided to compensate any sort of victims who are able to bring your car into Volkswagen, get an estimate, and move forward. Next is environmental, and they must repair any sort of environmental damage, which will be really hard, but also public wants them to make investments into actual clean technology. They don't want to be lied to anymore. They'd rather not have it than have a fake one. And then last, but probably the most important, is to hold the executives personally accountable for what happened with Volkswagen and their vehicles. No one has taken blame, although people have said, yes, I feel responsible, but I never actually had a hand in it. Here's who did it, here's who did it, here's who did it. The public wants someone to take accountability, and they want someone to move forward in order to reestablish trust and begin buying Volkswagen vehicles. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, I'd like to open the floor now.